loved it. That means we got a clean sweep of the TV. I know we got a rave in the news. The Post hated it, but if we get the New York Times, we're in.
If we don't get the Times, we don't run?
Let me tell you something, sweetheart. In this town, if you don't get a rave review from the New York Times, you close, period.
They heard the audience.
It's almost a show business cliche. The cast and crew waiting in Sardis for the reviews after a Broadway premiere. Good ones can ensure success and riches. Bad ones can often doom a production to an early demise.
Oh, my God.
Some argue that this influence extends to movies and television programs, but to a lesser extent. In any case, there are those who say the critics' power is undeserved and unchecked.
I'm going to go home. Call me in the morning. Let me know what happens. Come on, Ian. All right, here we go. Night, night. Ivan, the time.
Good morning, I'm Charlie Rose in Washington. Welcome to the CBS News Night Watch. Sometimes there seems more to debate about critics than what they write about. This morning, a special Night Watch debate. Resolved, critics are self-aggrandizing and vicious and often not qualified to tell the artist and the audience what's worth seeing. Debating in favor of the resolution, award-winning playwright, screen and television writer Peter Stone. Debating against the resolution, Time Magazine's chief drama critic, William Henry III. Our debate will continue in just a few moments, and later we'll hear from members of our studio audience here at the Watergate Hotel. They include some of the country's top television critics and filmmakers and actors from the Washington area. But first, we take a look at the latest news for this Thursday, March the 21st. Sam Ford is in our newsroom.
My name is Addison DeWitt. My native habitat is the theater. In it, I toil not, neither do I spin. I am a critic and commentator. I am essential to the theater.
In the 1950 movie, All About Eve, the critic was portrayed as an arrogant manipulator. In The Producers, the critic was so powerful a figure, he had to be bribed.
It's a $100 bill wrapped around these tickets.
That's no mistake. Enjoy the show.
You're stuck just what you think you're doing.
I'm bribing you. Just play ball. There's a lot more where that came from.
But fictional characters aren't the only ones with complaints about critics.
Certainly, I have never yet read a notice, either of my work or anybody else's, that informed or enlightened me in any way.
Glenda Jackson's alarm about the state of criticism is mirrored throughout the entertainment industry. The all-powerful critics have their say about film, about television, about theater. And their numbers seem to be increasing all the time. There are about 2,000 critics today in the United States, and some of them are better known than the stars they talk and write about.
In short, Cat People is a dog.
But as their numbers and influence grow, people are beginning to wonder, do we really need or want critics at all? There are questions about what they do for us and to us, about their qualifications and even their ethics, and especially about whether their criticism is fair and humane. Critic John Simon once wrote that the film Taxi Driver was, quote, saddled with Miss Sybil Shepherd, whose presence is not even a tribute to director Martin Scorsese's healthy appetites. Having gained weight in the face, she looks like Mussolini in drag. About Last Tango in Paris, Simon wrote, it, quote, strikes me as yet another pretentious, empty, dishonest film by that arrogant, attitudinizing, derivative, monstrously slick filmmaker Bernardo Bertolucci. Is this legitimate commentary? Simon defends his work by saying the main goal of criticism is to make people think by orthodox or unorthodox methods.
I see the film or the theatrical work in front of me, and I don't think of it in terms of hurt feelings or pique or annoyance for me or for them or for anyone. I feel that I have to be honest about what I see, as if there were no suffering human beings involved.
As one critic wrote, either you are a critic or you have a lot of friends. Show me a chap who can reconcile these opposites, and I'll show you a failure.
I take it you read well.
It wasn't a reading, it was a performance. Brilliant, vivid, something made of music and
Here is our
fire.
resolution. Critics are self-aggrandizing and vicious and often not qualified to tell the artist and the audience what's worth seeing. Our opening remarks from Mr. Peter Stone.
Well, who could possibly argue with that statement? I've been writing for the Broadway stage for nearly 25 years. I've had productions of 10 plays and musicals that have then gone on to road companies and stock and amateur productions, which means that I've been reviewed by virtually every drama critic, major or minor, in America. And it has been a very grisly experience. That dramatists and artists in general should be subjected to this ritual bloodbath every morning after the opening or the appearance of a play seems fairly unreasonable. None of the other professions have to support it. Doctors, lawyers, businessmen, clergymen. I mean, if you can imagine a doctor, you know, who had to pick up a paper and read that Dr. So-and-so performed a gallbladder operation last night. It was sheer butchery. The man should never be allowed in a operation theater again, you know. And then out front they put a little quote ad in front of the hospital: butchery, New York Post, you know. I mean, they don't have to do that. No, it's reserved for the most sensitive of our society: the poets, the writers, the painters, the musicians, the people really who are possible to be most damaged by such treatment. Now, I would be foolish to say that critics, that there are not among the drama critics in America some very, very good ones. I say that for two reasons. One is because it's true, and also because if any of them are listening, they'll think I mean them. I'm still a practicing writer, and I'm sure that my colleague tonight is one of those. But there are, most critics in America, I think, suffer from four basic things that I'd like to talk about, and those are that they are basically unqualified, that they are gossip mongers, that they are self-aggrandizing, and that they are angry, often to the point of savagery.
We'll get to all of those points now for the rebuttal. Mr. Time Magazine's chief drama critic, William Henry III.
Well, I think this is just another instance of shooting the messenger. I heard a couple of the common canards brought up by Mr. Stone, whose work I personally admire. First, we hear that artists are sensitive. Well, you know, these are people who have chosen to be in the public eye. They've thrust themselves out demanding attention, and they call themselves artists, but they're really businessmen. They're doing this for a living. They're saying, I want your time and I want your money. And if they're going to do that, then they have to expect that other people say, oh yeah, well, on what basis? It's an act of monstrous arrogance, really, to say, I'm so important, I have such interesting things to say, that you've got to listen to me and, what's more, pay for the privilege. And it is utterly unreasonable to expect then to control the circumstances under which you're discussed and the kinds of things that are going to be said about you. In my experience, most critics are sincere, well-meaning, intelligent people, and they are not part of the artistic establishment as the artists expect them to be. They are journalists. They're part of the journalistic establishment. They are reporters, and they're performing a consumer service. They are going out and trying to find out about things that other people are interested in, both to help them understand how a work of art fits in with the rest of society, how ideas in one sector of society are playing off against each other, and also to help people make judgments about their leisure and their disposable cash. And it seems to me that those are reasonable things for a critic to do. I'm sorry that Mr. Stone thinks it's a grisly experience, but by and large, nobody objects to a good review, even if it's completely wrong-headed. They're mostly interested in getting the quotes. And the publicists, at least, I can't speak for the playwrights, always want the attention. They'd rather any review than none, even if it's negative, because they know there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Now for rebuttal, first Mr. Stone.
Well, I don't think shooting the messenger, in this case, the messenger writes his own message, one thinks. And therefore, it's the message that one is shooting, not the messenger. Secondly, I have no objection to honest criticism, even when I disagree with it. It is the right of everyone to have an opinion. What is disturbing is when the opinion is based on no qualifications in order to hold such an opinion, or when it disintegrates into anger and savagery, when they deal in gossip, and also when they are looking to promote themselves rather than do their job, which is to criticize the play. I have no objection to any critic who honestly gives his opinion, given that that opinion is based on some background of knowledge, about a play. Even when it's bad, I do not, even when it's a bad review of mine, if it is honestly intended, and I may disagree with it, but I certainly respect his right to do it.
Mr. Henry?
Well, one man's qualification is not necessarily another's. If you expect a critic to have been a playwright or a director or an actor or whatever, one of two things is true. Either he was successful at it, in which case, why is he a critic? Or he was a failure at it, in which case he's probably going to be a worse and meaner critic. What's more, one man's gossip is another man's investigative reporting. I understand that a lot of producers don't like anybody to say, well, you know, there used to be problems with this script, or this show was in trouble out of town, or there's a lot of backstage bickering going on here. But that's perfectly legitimate reporting. This is a public enterprise. This is not somebody's private little therapy session with his analyst. They're asking people to come into the theater. And if you're going to be a qualified critic, you above all are a qualified audience member. What you need to understand is what's going on in the rest of society, not what's going on inside the writer's head.
There you have our opening remarks. Again, one more time, the resolution. Critics are self-aggrandizing and vicious, and often not qualified to tell the artist and the audience what's worth seeing. Mr. Peter Stone, Mr. Bill Henry from Time Magazine, an audience here of television critics from around the country and some filmmakers from the Washington area. We'll be back as Nightwatch continues. The role of critics. Stay with us. We're debating the role of critics in our society. Joining us here in Washington, Mr. Peter Stone, award-winning playwright, also an award-winning Pulitzer Prize-winning critic from Time Magazine, Mr. William Henry III. Somehow, when you talk about critics, John Simon's name somehow always comes up. Here is what Mr. Simon said in a review of Liza Minnelli in Cabaret. Plain, ludicrously, rather than pathetically plain is what Miss Minnelli is. That turnipy nose overhanging a forward gaping mouth and hastily retreating chin, that bulbous cranium with eyes as big and as inexpressive as saucers, those are the appurtenances of a clown, not even a sad one. And given a matching figure, desperately uplifted breast, waist indistinguishable from hips, you cannot play Sally Bowles. Mr. Henry, legitimate criticism?
You know, there's certainly a kernel. That's a tough one to defend, but there's certainly a kernel of legitimate criticism there. When you're talking about...
Which kernel?
If you are talking about whether somebody is appropriate to a role, whether looking at somebody and hearing someone's voice evokes the feelings that are supposed to be evoked, then it's legitimate. That may not have been kindly phrased, but if that is not his image of what Sally Bowles ought to be, if in his view the appearance of the artist gets in the way of the sensibility that the play is supposed to be about, then it's perfectly fair to say this person is wrong for the role. There are admittedly gentler ways of doing so, but I don't think that it's incumbent upon us to go around to require everybody to write in soft, muted drawing room tones.
Mr. Stone?
Well, I don't think it's necessary to comment on that. That is so clearly unsuitable and unfitting that it doesn't really require much conversation. Mr. Simon, who is normally an intelligent and a good critic, has his personal aberrations. They are very striking, and I don't enjoy discussing anybody's psychoses, and I don't think they have to be discussed here. I think that's his problem. It's also, unfortunately, the problem of any young lady to whom they are mostly directed, who doesn't fit his particular personal image of what beauty is. But that sort of centerfold thing can't belong to everybody, and that's his, as I say, his problem. It's not really endemic of the entire profession.
Is this, though, kind of criticism any different than what a director might say to another director as he is auditioning performers for the role?
Yeah, but that's done in private. That is done as a private comment. I don't think there's any necessity in private to be even that visual. I've never heard anyone
Who put it in public? You know, the actress chose to go public, and the producer and the director and the playwright chose to go public. And if it's a television show or movie, whatever, all those people have chosen to have public careers. And just as if you're about 4'2" and your voice is a falsetto, it may be hard for you to run for the United States Senate because people are going to say, oh, he's very short and has a squeaky voice. So they can perfectly legitimately say, well, you know, he's not quite my image of Mark Anthony.
Well, unfortunately, that argument might be put forward in a more tragic instance. A man decides to go into public life, therefore he's fair game for assassins who don't like his way. So someone's hiding behind a wall and takes a pot shot at it.
Sticks and stones may, etc. You know, it's quite different.
Not to an actress.
Well, that's because she has chosen to make her face her fortune.
Peter Stone, William Henry III, an audience of television critics and filmmakers. Back in a moment as Night Match continues. Stay with us. Let me come back to the last point that you made, Mr. Henry. You wouldn't want anyone seeing your copy until you had finished it and turned it over to the editor for publication in the magazine or newspaper.
When it's turned in for publication, it's meant for an audience.
Is that the same as the opening?
No.
Oh, yeah.
The opening is weeks after they've started having people come in and pay money to see the show. Why is it that the people who come before the official opening suddenly don't count as consumers?
Henry, why are you placing the critic in an adversarial position all the time? The fact is that the play is ready opening night. The process happens to be special. The process of drama is that you cannot really fine-tune it, you cannot rewrite it, you cannot really make it proper in a final draft until it is played in front of an audience. Why won't the critics allow us to finish our process and make the play as good as we can? And you're not the guardian, for heaven's sakes, of the public. You are of the public's money. You are the guardian of the public's taste. You are the guardian of their aesthetic interests. If the finances of the theater are so complicated and so difficult and so expensive today that this is the procedure necessary, let it be. It's not hurting anybody.
If we're writing about a show, we're writing about it because it is in some sense news. And to me, this whole concern with controlling the circumstances of when it's written about is of a piece with the desire on the part of most playwrights that the critics simply say, I liked or didn't like, understood or didn't understand what was in front of me. A lot of playwrights are outraged if you try to talk about how the ideas in the show connect to things that are going on elsewhere in society, if you attempt to connect a work of art with the times in which it's produced, if your ideas are evident there as well as his. He wants simply to have his ideas translated directly to the audience.
I don't feel that's any ironclad rule of playwrights. You may have run into a playwright or two who want their play discussed rather than the critic displaying his own particular expertise in other areas. But as long as he's writing about the play, I don't think a critic, an author minds that particularly. But oftentimes, the qualifications of the critic are so strange. They have no background in the literature of the theater. When it's an adaptation, they don't know the source material. Most of them write so poorly. It is so depressing to be criticized by someone who doesn't write as well as you do. And then you run.
Of course, he may not be paid as well either.
Well, that's his choice. You're very fond of saying no one forced us to become theater writers.
Absolutely.
No one forced you to become
Look, I'm
critics.
just saying to you, maybe the publisher can't get anybody any better.
That's possible, but nevertheless, we have to rely on it.
Speak to the issue of qualifications, though. The idea he is raising, that people who are writing, in many cases, do not have the requisite qualifications and or interest in the particular medium.
Well, interest is one thing, background is another. You acquire your credentials chiefly by doing this sort of thing. As it happens, I've had a little experience acting professionally, and I've written scripts, and I've had some small involvement, not so much in recent years, in that side of the business. But I don't think it's a requirement. You are there as a surrogate for the literate, intelligent member of the audience, and your qualification is that you can bring the average man's discerning, informed taste, not that you are a part of the artistic apparatus, not that you are a part of the theater.
And isn't it possible that there are two kinds of skills? One is to be a critic, and the other is to be a playwright.
There's no question of it. But Mr. Henry's qualifications are perfectly admirable. we have to put up with, dramatists have to put up with a kind of critic which is new upon the scene. That is the television critic. Now, don't get me wrong. There's an audience of television critics. I'm not speaking about those who write for newspapers about television. I'm talking about those who go on the air, on television, on camera, and are critics of the plays.
They're not critics. They're entertainers.
That's exactly
They
correct.
are to the theater what the TV weatherman is to meteorology. He is the popularizer. He's the popularizer. He's not the researcher.
But on that point,
They are
Mr.
there.
Stone and Mr. Henry,
We'll get back to that, I trust.
we will get back to that, you can be sure. Night Match continues. The role of the critic, including television critics. Stay with us. I want to do two things. One is expand the nature of our conversation not only to drama critics, but also television critics, the people who criticize television, also people who criticize film, so that we're throwing a broad criticism, also book reviewers, or the idea of critics in our society is our debate. And I also want to bring this audience involved in the conversation. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, you're talking about playwrights and plays. When you write a play, or an artist puts paint on a wall or paint on a canvas, who is the determining factor of raising the value of that up? Is that not the critic?
Eventually, it's posterity. I think work eventually seeks its own level, as is proven by every great master who... I mean, no one bought Cézanne couldn't sell a painting his entire lifetime. So with Modigliani and so forth. The same thing happens with composers who live in poverty, who now are... I think that eventually time takes care of that. Critics certainly contribute, and the better critics contribute a great deal more.
I'm not going to disagree with that.
Yes, sir.
I happen to be in a difficult situation. I'm a guest artist contract with Maryland Academy of Dramatic Arts, where I teach, write, and direct. And one thing we insist that the young professional performer read those critiques, regardless of who the writer are, because we are consumers. And it becomes very difficult to look for something to help us. What would you suggest, Mr. Henry, that we young actors should be looking for in those critiques to help us to prevent any type of critiques like you're referring to?
Well, if you read a lot of criticism, you'll begin to find that some is better than others. I think the rules of thumb that one looks for in good criticism, and that you find in the criticism that's most helpful, are first a constructive approach, not simply defining what's wrong, but trying to talk about what might have made something better. A recognition of where the fault lay. I mean, some problems are caused by actors, some problems more likely lie with directors or designers, some with writers. The better sort of critic can make at least an educated guess as to how the difficulty came about. And the better sort of critic will also try to talk in terms of, well, you know, he might not have been suitable for this role, or this play doesn't go in the right direction, but you know, there is something else he could do, and here's a guess as to what it is.
But I find that critics have a problem in terms of what they're able to criticize. For instance, drama critics have to do musicals. They don't know anything about music except what they like to hear for the most part. They don't know anything about dance for the most part. They're not trained or experienced in that. They don't really even understand what a musical book is, one finds. I'm a musical book author, and so I'm very sensitive to the fact. They think that it's the dialogue or the jokes. Well, everyone knows the actors make that up as they go along, so it couldn't possibly be that. It's the construction of the play is the musical book, basically. It's the libretto of the play. They don't seem to understand that. Anyone who says it's a wonderful music, but the book was bad, is wrong. It was a wonderful musical, but the book was bad, is wrong. Musicals can't succeed without a good book, and that is what has become evident all along. So they're not truly, I think, broad enough to encompass a very complex form.
Well, it takes a long time to learn to do it properly. I've been writing about movies on and off for 15 years, television for 10, plays and books for 20, and I am spread a little thin despite my appearance. Still in all, I do find that as I go along, I get better because I know more about the techniques of doing these things. Part of it is that if you get a critic who is competent in his job, he will tend to stay in it for 30 or 40 years. And if you catch him in about year 32, you'll really get a good deal out of him.
Let me get some more people involved. Yes, sir.
Mr. Stone, I'm Bill Donaldson from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I think I'm confused by all this debate. Number one, I've never heard anybody complain about a good review. Number two, if you write one that is not terribly good or not terribly flattering, then suddenly every reader in the business is qualified to ask about your qualifications, What is qualifications, and why in heaven's name does a critic or a reviewer have to be an expert in every aspect of the art?
Clearly, they don't. The fact is the fact that nobody complains about a good review is simply relief over having escaped once again. Although I must say I've had extremely good reviews on something that I said this is nonsense. I say it privately, but nevertheless I say this is nonsense. But I'm delighted I got by with that.
Let me just come to a point you made. The role of the critic. The question comes, and Glenda Jackson, recently a guest on this broadcast, said she'd never learned anything from a critic. Is the critic's role to somehow instruct the actor, or is it to appraise the performance for an audience that reads or listens to him?
I think an actor might have difficulty learning anything from a critic. I don't think actors learn in that way. But a writer could learn from a critic, and has. The greatest critic of them all, bar none, namely Aristotle, has taught every writer. I mean, Aristotle was, if you read Aristotle, you need never read another theater critic. And I can recommend that. But the fact is that every writer learned from Aristotle. That is criticism in its best and most really thrilling.
He manifests himself at my house late at night. I'm under his tutelage.
Then I admire you enormously. I think you'll do very well.
Yes.
I'm Judy Flander with the United Feature Syndicate, syndicated columnist, and an erstwhile fellow colleague of Phil Henry's. And in my opinion, the majority of people who are, we haven't been talking much about television criticism. The majority of television critics are not investigative reporters. Many of them started by being critics rather than reporters. So that I don't buy your idea on that aspect. And this isn't exactly a question, I can see that. But the other thing is personal attacks that people make on someone like the one that Mr. Rose read. I personally don't see any justification in it, and I would really like to see, I'd like to have you say a little more about that. And have I got one more second? Washington had a big scandal a few years ago when a former theater critic, Richard Coe, attacked Vivica Lanford when she was in I Am a Woman, just exactly the way Mr. Simon attacked Lisa Minnelli. And he got letters beyond count for doing that.
Okay, what we'd like to do, because I'm up against the break, rather than getting into that, we'll come back and answer both of those questions. Okay. We'll do that as Night Match continues. Stay with us. There's a question on the floor. Mr. Henry?
Well, I certainly don't want to defend attacking somebody's bridge work or the shape of his nose or whatever. Anytime I look in the mirror, I'm discouraged from saying that somebody else ain't so hot. But it does seem to me that one can legitimately attack a public personality for the aspects that that person has chosen to make public. You know, I think that it's hard to imagine what would be an unkind review of Pia Zadora. You know, this is somebody who's trying to buy her way into show business. Her talents are modest, her bankroll is not, and she has largely bypassed the kind of training that people look for. I don't think, in general, that most critics do engage in that sort of attack, except when they have really been offended by something. And if they're writing from that kind of anger, it's an honest response, and it's usually not a unique one.
I think that it's not just attacks on people for their physical attributes. I think critics, and then we get into the area that was in the original premise, and that is about self-aggrandizement. I think critics want, like everyone else, to get ahead in life. They want a better job. They want to call attention more. They want to be successful. They want to be famous.
Now, wait. Did Walter Kerr get ahead by self-aggrandizing in that way? Did Pauline Kael do that? If you look, if you look at the critics who have really succeeded, none of them has done it that way.
As I said at the beginning, I'm not talking about
John Simon.
No, I'm not talking about John Simon. I'm talking about the great majority of the critics, not the 4 or 5 or 6 that we might name, which I certainly include you in, I'm happy to say. But I'm talking about those out there who find that the best way to make a mark for themselves is to say something really clever and memorable. The problem is you can't say anything clever and like something. Of all the wonderful remarks that have been made about plays, we know them all. She ran the gamut from A to B. We saw the play under a disadvantage. The curtain was up. Or so-and-so played Othello. Othello lost. You know, that sort of concept. Not one of them has ever been in approval of a play because you can't be funny and like something. So what happens is they do cheap shots on your name. The very first review I ever had, it was in Time magazine, I'm sorry to say. My first play, I'd worked like a dog, and I opened up in the last line. There was a play that it was a big hit in Boston, came to New York, and here's what I read. There's a subject that required a Shakespeare. Unfortunately, we were given a stone. Now, there was my name. I mean, I guess I should be lucky my name wasn't Stumblebum, you know, because he couldn't have resisted it. But supposing you write your play, and you write a play and a critic on a hot tin roof by William A. Henry III, and it opens, and you open Time magazine, and it ends by saying, Shakespeare gave us Henry the IV and the V. Unfortunately, last night all we got was Henry III. I mean, what do you do with that? It's an idea of a critic making a mark for himself at your expense. I mean, remember George Kaufman's remark? There was an actor playing Romeo once, and his name happened to be, he was Italian, his name was Guido Nazzo, and the review was, Guido Nazzo was not so Guido. Now, it's memorable, but I have the feeling had he been wonderful, Mr. Kaufman could not have resisted the line. It comes once in a lifetime.
Well, maybe.
Mr. Henry.
I just don't believe that people go and see something and like it and respect it and then say, but I'm going to ignore my opinion, I'm going to trample on my own integrity and judgment, and I'm going to go back and write a negative piece because that's going to make me look better. The vast majority of critics, John Simon himself wrote a piece several years ago in which he quoted one of his innumerable girlfriends saying that when he saw something that he didn't like, he wanted to lop its head off. And when Bob Brustein saw something he didn't like, he was sorry for the state of the theater. Well, I just think there are a lot more Bob Brusteins. Certainly among the critics I know, and I know them by the dozen, they would prefer to come away happy.
Let me get someone else in from the audience. Yes, sir.
Yes, Steve Sonsky, Miami Herald. Mr. Stone, you made the earlier assertion that a Broadway-bound play should not be reviewed out of town.
No, I did not. No, I'm sorry. You misunderstood me. No, I know. I said it should not be reviewed by the New York critics until it is opened. That was all I said. Of course we must be reviewed out of town. Out-of-town reviews are the most helpful things we can get.
In terms of what? Practicing your art in terms of in front of an out-of-town audience and then refining it for New York?
Exactly. I mean, out-of-town reviews, one goes to chooses cities because of certain critics. Washington happens to be a very good city to try out because the critics are good. Boston, another very good city to go to. For years, I wouldn't go to Philadelphia because what doesn't help you out of town are two things. A rave review doesn't help you because you don't learn, your show isn't ready for raves, clearly, and you haven't learned anything from it. And a rotten review doesn't help you because you might as well go home. What you want is somebody, and up in Boston it's usually the Monitor or the Globe, who tells you, something that you really listen to, and you say, gee, you know, that's something we have to work on.
You had also said that the critic, in your view, was not the guardian of the theater goer's money.
Yes, I believe that.
Who should perform that function?
I don't think anybody
should just. How would they know about the play? Should they just walk into a play and spend $32.50 blindly?
$32.50.
That's Miami price.
That's $45
in New York.
What's the New York price now?
$45, $50.
Oh, wait, that's a musical. $45, that's a musical. It's not not the price of a straight
Mr. Stone, you really want to respond to the last point?
Well, yes, I think that the critic need not worry about the purse strings. What he worries about is saying this play is good or it's bad. The purse strings take care of themselves. If he says it's bad, nobody will go to it. I don't think he has to worry about the audience being built by the producer. Yes. His statement is the operative one anyway.
Hi, Dan Ruth from the Chicago Sun-Times. During this whole discussion tonight, the one thing I really haven't heard is a definition of a critic. And I don't, you may not buy mine, but I've always looked upon a critic as nothing more and nothing less than a barometer of public opinion against which the consumer, and I agree with Bill's viewpoint on that, can measure their own opinion against the critics. And if you look at a critic in that sense, our opinion up to a point is relatively irrelevant, because a critic, once the consumer or the reader understands what a critic's point of view is, that's all the critic's audience has to know, because then if you write something that's scathing and people disagree with you fairly consistently, they'll know they like it, and vice versa.
Good point. Let's get a clear sense of definition and role.
Very rarely is a critic a barometer of the public. He is, the public mostly, I have too often seen critics going to a play, a comedy, ignoring the audience there around them who are laughing or who might be having a good time. I heard one television critic, and I know we've agreed not to, that they are weather people, but the fact is that I heard one say the author must have been in the back of the house telling jokes. They ignore the audience for the most part. I don't consider that being a barometer. I consider that being a bellwether.
Well, I think there's just a lot of different kinds of critics. Some of them see themselves as consumer surrogates. Some of them think that their job is to raise public taste or enhance public awareness. Some of them just want to give information about whether to go or not. Some of them see themselves as part of the show business world. And there's room for all of them.
We'll be right back, talking about the role of critics today. Stay with us. We go back to our audience for another question.
Yes, Mr. Stone, I think we can agree that theater critics have a lot more power than TV critics, because a bad review for a play can close it overnight. Bad review for a television series and keep it on the air for 5 seasons or so. You've had experience with the Defenders and, of course, a lot on Broadway. Do you think that theater critics should be held perhaps to a far higher standard than television critics, because the stakes are apparently higher?
Well, I would think that there is a hierarchy. As writers like to go from television to film or from film to stage, in other words, if there's an advancement, I think critics want to move, as in fact Mr. Henry did, move up to drama criticism, which I think is the place to go.
That's his idea. It's not
mine. I understand. No, I'm not giving you that intention. I think that they should not be held to a higher standard, but I think they should have. I think they're dealing with much more complex thoughts, much more complex language and ideas, and therefore have to be more complex critics. I do think that's...
One last question. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Nancy Anderson, Copley News Service. I'm puzzled by the phrase worth watching, which is included in the proposition, as it applies to television, particularly since it's free, also movies to a certain extent. Is something worth watching if it makes somebody laugh so hard or be so frightened that they forget their problems of the day, or does it have to change the person's view of God or politics or nuclear war?
Well, as a determined watcher of the A-Team and a frequent watcher of Dukes of Hazzard reruns, I can assure you that it doesn't need to be Proust or Chekhov for me. I think that people experience lots of different kinds of art in lots of different moods. Most of us have fairly diverse individual tastes, and I think that's all to the good. And I certainly welcome critics who are prepared to acknowledge that it doesn't have to prove their upper middle brow credentials in order for them to like it.
We now have to go to a final summary, starting with you, Mr. Henry.
Well, I'll wave and give the time to Mr. Stone, and then I'll rebut him.
Well, we'll do that if that's satisfactory to you, Mr. Stone.
I thought by starting first, I thought I got the last word. I don't need the last word. I do want to make a final summation about one particular subject, and that's anger or savagery, as I refer to it often. I think it's the most serious and most damaging thing that can happen in criticism. I think that most plays, it's true, are bad. But most everything is bad. Most dentists are bad. Most plumbers are bad. Most everything is bad. Most critics are bad. Most electric toasters are bad. So I think that's a fact of life. But when a man sits down, or a woman...
Less than 30 seconds.
Thank you. When a man or woman sits down and pours out their insides for a year or 2 years and does that, I think that if it turns out badly, I think that it's an occasion more for sadness than for anger. I don't understand the savagery. When Tennessee Williams, in his last few plays, the same critics who wrote the obituaries and said he was one of the great critics of America, one of the great playwrights of America, they're the same ones who savaged his plays. They savaged Albee. They called him a note. They savaged these people. Why are they so angry? Is it because they think they could have written it better? Is it because they know they couldn't have written it better?
I have to interrupt. Last word from you was let them down gently.
Well, I'm inclined to think that a plea for kindness is perfectly legitimate. I do think one of the sad facts of the critical establishment in American life is that somebody gets lifted up only to be knocked down. It's the post-hit syndrome, and you see it with novelists and playwrights and so on. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think it's also understandable human nature. The higher the peak that you scale, the more people expect you to keep climbing to that level, and if you can't quite make it up, they're going to be disappointed. But I think when the critic is disappointed, when the critic is angry, it's an honest response. And although it may be a painful response for a playwright, a novelist, a filmmaker, a television producer to experience, it's not a unique response.
I'm out of time. Peter Stone, William Henry, the third, members of this audience, thank you very much for joining us for this special edition of Night Match. We will continue. Stay with us.